Oh, it's high.
So high you can't get over it.
So high.
So wide you can't get around it. So low you can't get under it.
You might as well come in at the door. The gate is high.
So high you can't get over it. So wide you can't get around
So
it.
low.
So low you can't get under
You
it.
might as well come in at the door. I went down to the valley. You know I did. No glad to stay. My soul got happy in the valley, and I stayed down there all day. And the gate is high.
So high you can't get over
So
it.
wide.
So wide you can't get around
So
it.
low.
So low you can't get under
You
it.
might as well come in at the door. And I ain't been to heaven.
Hey, welcome everyone. It's another Presbycast show. It's a tough job. Someone has to walk through all 32 games over the next 2 days, and so we just decided that we'd do it here. I guess we'll start with was it Ole Miss versus the Tar Heels? Everyone thought they were a bubble team. They're certainly bragging like they, won a team when Tar Heels, all they did was just beat a team that probably didn't deserve to be in anyways. And I say that as a 4-year alumnus of San Diego State. I don't know. This is going to take a while. I don't even have a bracket in front of me. So you guys guide me along with what game we're going to talk on next. We've got the next
actually, we're
90
ready.
minutes to do this.
We're getting ready for June.
How far do you guys think Michigan State's going to go this year? I just can't see them not winning the whole thing.
June Madness is what we're talking about here.
Oh, well, okay.
So it's we call it silly season, but it's I didn't really want to take the plunge this year, but I thought we have to start sometime or we'll never get done with this. There are already 22 overtures to the PCA General Assembly. Let me clarify for the novices: an overture is we had do overtures a couple of years ago, but an overture is a request from an individual or a court session or presbytery to the General Assembly that they do something or say something. So that's basically what it is. It used to be called bills and overtures, but now it's just overtures. It's a uniquely Presbyterian thing, and it may seem like a crazy thing to get excited about or worry very much about, but it's really become the focus of what happens at PCA General Assembly. So we are joined by two PCA teaching elders, Matt, the coach, the ecclesial coach, Adams, and Scott Spreadberg Edberg. He used to be something in the PCA, but he's been usurped by officialdom. His spreadsheet empire has crumbled down. So you want to tell us about that, Scott?
Yeah, I kind of brought it down. I sat the charges and plunged it and gave it over to the AC because it's too much work. And so I'm glad to no longer have to deal with it.
So you tracked the presbytery voting on all these overtures and rendered a great service, but now it's been taken over by the headquarters. Coach Matt Adams, you of South Carolina. So Scott, you're in Indiana. So we have some geographical diversity. Is it okay? It's all the same to me, so that's fine.
Midwest.
But with
anything beyond the Mason-Dixon.
If you average the height of Scott and Matt, you have the normal sized human being, which is good. So we're strikingly average when you look at it like that. So
Coach is a tall guy. I mean, we should
a strapping young fellow,
yeah,
as they say. So how are things in South Carolina in the greater Dillon metropolitan statistical area?
Weather was beautiful today, and things are going well. We just got done with some prayer meeting and some fellowship, and ready to rock and roll on some General Assembly predictions.
Yeah, it is appropriate that your church has a prayer meeting because the man who pastored there before you, Dr. Doug Kelly, as I listened to hours and hours of his systematic theology class from RTS, which was free on iTunes back about 10 years ago. He said many times, your church ought to have a prayer meeting. And your church does. It still does.
Indeed. Yep.
Yes. Well, our church does that as well. Not every PCA church does, but
Just good ones.
I didn't say that. You said it. So anyway, I'm going to try not to say much because I've had this flu for 2 weeks and I'm at a low ebb in capacity. But what I want us to do is sort of take the temperature of the PCA based on the overtures that have been received thus far. The deadline for overtures that change the Constitution is what, Scott? Late May, third week of May, something like that.
That'd be April 23rd, I believe.
Oh, April.
Yeah.
2 months. That's
Yeah,
right.
60 days out.
So probably most of the overtures that would request a change to the Constitution have already been submitted, but a lot of overtures this year are asking other things that aren't amending the Constitution, but so that only require a month's lead time to be considered. So a lot of stuff's happening in the PCA, and sometimes when a lot of stuff's happening, a lot of missives or missiles are written and sent in, and that's one of the ways you tell what's on the minds of the presbyters and the churches in the PCA. So before we put some stuff on screen and talk about specific things, we'll start with you, Matt. What's the general tenor of the debate in the churches and the presbyteries online? We know it's a little different online than it is in other places, but what's your feeling for the PCA this year?
When it comes to overtures, Brad, I think that many of them are pretty non-controversial. We have probably more than I can remember in recent history, the changing of presbytery boundary lines and some clarifications here and there that probably need to be there overall. I think the real work of the General Assembly this year will be during the committee and agency reports. I think that a lot of people are chomping at the bit to hear some of those and to see what kind of information the committees and agencies are presenting to the commissioners this year. So I think COCs actually will be where a lot of the work is being done this June.
Yeah, so you referred to committees of commissioners, which meet the first 2 days of the assembly, and they sort of provide oversight for the boards and agencies.
Review and control. That's a good Presbyterian term.
And that's been a theme. There's been more questioning of the agencies and the headquarters, if you will, from the pews and from the session rooms, maybe than there has been in the past. And I guess technically from the presbyteries, because most of these overtures come from presbyteries. So what you've got when an overture is passed is you've got a meeting of 30 to 100 men, depending on the size of the presbytery, and a majority have to vote to approve these things, normally written by local church sessions. So there's there's three steps minimum here, and it is part of the grassroots nature of Presbyterianism as the PCA practices it. That basically, if you're an elder, you've got access to the GA. You've got a shot at getting something before them, and it's not. And even if a presbytery rejects it, an individual or a session can send something up, and we've seen just a couple of examples of an individual's overture or proposal making it before the assembly and even passing. We had that happen last year, and it was extraordinary, but not unheard of. So, Scott, what's your thought of the general tenor and state of the little ecclesial festival we call the Presbyterian Church in America General Assembly?
The past few years have been focused on review and control. I think I do agree with Matt in that the overtures committee doesn't really seem to have anything that's too controversial. I wonder what are some of the resolves that are going to come out of the Metro New York case that has been resent to the SJC. We'll probably hear from that in the coming weeks, maybe month or so, and
You
whether
refer
we'll
to
have
the-
more work to do.
Yeah, you refer to the case of a female Episcopal, she would call herself a priest. We wouldn't use that term. But a female Episcopal priest, in fact, the first ordained female Episcopal priest, quite a famous person, and an author, and well known to a certain type of person, is a big fan of this lady, and she preached that was the judgment of the General Assembly. She preached on a Sunday service, and there's been a lot of back and forth on that. The wheels of Presbyterian justice. I'm not saying they're square, but they do turn slow. So we're still in process on that. But yeah, so that would come up. Would that be in the review of Presbytery records report once again?
Depends. I mean, it could be both
the
the
SJC.
SJC and
Yeah,
we'll get a report from the SJC, and if there's anything more actionable, then we'll hear from RPR probably as well.
Yeah, and the SJC is the Standing Judicial Commission. The PCA the PCA General Assembly, which now numbers over 2,000 for the last 4 or 5 years, does not try to hear judicial cases as a court of the whole. They have made an elected commission to handle these top level discipline cases. So if we say SJC, that's what we mean.
Brad.
I kind of like this,
Yes.
Brad. You just define everything that we say.
Yeah,
And
that's
so-
right.
Well, I have to.
You're
I
like
have
our
to
walking
have-
Presbyterian dictionary.
I have to have.
We
I have
used to
put-
not define acronyms on this
Yeah.
show. I want the
Well-
record to state. FTR, we used to not do that.
That's right. So I'm just trying to put myself in the place of the listener who may not know.
Well,
There-
you're
there-
here to serve, Brad, and we
We
appreciate
have new
it.
people all the time. And that's
I was going to say, because Scott made a comment that I think that would be probably beneficial for our listeners to think through or to hear more about. He said something about the Metro New York case possibly coming up through the SJC report, but it might be more actionable depending on what the RPR report says. Scott, can you kind of lend our listeners a little bit more information on why the RPR report would be more actionable by the body and not the SJC report?
Yeah, because every time Metro New York meets, they create new minutes and they have new actions, and that those actions are subject to the review and control of RPR. And so the most immediate will come from them, whatever they've done over the last year, or if they've not done anything, that might also be of note. But it could also have some implication with the SJC in that it just depends how the SJC decides to handle their corrections or what the work of Metro New York has been. They might have wanted them to do more. And so they could even kick the issue out further. But their actions or their lack of will be under the scrutiny, I'm guessing, of RPR, because these are things that until they're resolved, the microscope will remain. And some other presbyteries have felt that through the years, and Metro New York is feeling that now.
Well, FWIW, there is a sense
That
in
means
which,
for our listeners there, for what it's worth, a common colloquial phrase.
Here in church, like enjoys you not.
and I mean, Brad, between your comments and Brad's comment about the SJC being a commission, they're just reporting their actions, where a committee report is debatable, and so there's more action that can be taken from the floor of the assembly just from that fact as well.
All right. Well, let's just we've had plenty of preview here, so we'll put on screen for live viewers or video viewers some categories that Scott put together, and we'll just kind of hit some of these high level. We can look at the overture in detail if we need to. But you've put 5 overtures under the discipline category, and that's discipline process, not discipline cases. But you want to hit the high points on these, Scott?
Yeah, so these are not they're not dealing with necessarily substantial changes. It's just if there is an amendment in the rules of discipline. Overture 1 generally deals with rewriting 32.2, which might sound ethereal, but it hopes to perhaps better lay out a process. When you're dealing with discipline in the PCA, it seems like there's a lot in the book because it's a substantial part of our blue book. But once you engage in discipline, you realize that you wish you had more details on what to do next. And there are some unofficial guides out there. But Overture 1 seeks to perhaps constitutionalize a general workflow through offenses and how to process them. And that comes from Northern New England. Perhaps what's of interesting note is that Overture 7 is a repeat from a few years ago when we were trying to address how does the assembly maintain original jurisdiction of a presbytery when they fail to act. You remember all that discussion. This is a repeat of it, of the presbytery that actually was probably scrutinized and the cause of the original amendment with the Greg Johnson case. But with this, it looks good to me personally. I think it should pass, but I don't know what the assembly will think. But it's basically a do-over from a few years ago. I can't tell you what 14 and 15. They're just really minor changes that seek to perhaps clarify and make more distinct languages when it comes to censures and delivering the censures, because there was a discrepancy on removal of censures and what needs to be said for each censure. That's getting kind of in the weeds, though, as you look at it.
If we circle back to Overture 7 with original jurisdiction, I was actually reading through all the rationale again today, and it was really interesting, their conversation at the end of that overture in the rationale section regarding why they decided, how they kind of thought through that failure to act language. Remember, it left everything fairly vague. And if they did absolutely anything, the court acted in some way, right? We might not think it was an action that was necessary or even sufficient, but the way they changed the language is failure to uphold the Constitution, which in their words, to summarize, they felt that was still somewhat vague, but it left a lot of options on how the interpretation from these, I think it's 5, right? 5 presbyteries who would request original jurisdiction, how they could explicitly agree upon how the Constitution was not upheld. And so I actually like the language, uphold the Constitution or upheld the Constitution, a failure to uphold the Constitution, because it does give the 5 presbytery options. Now, one of the things that was interesting to me about Overture 7 is that these 5 presbyteries have to agree on how the presbytery didn't uphold the Constitution. So,
not going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, so it's not like Scott's presbytery could come with one way that presbytery felt like, the presbytery another presbytery didn't uphold the Constitution, and PD, my presbytery, could come with a totally different way that we didn't feel like they upheld the Constitution. And so I guess it would take some collaboration, right, guys, amongst those 5 presbyteries, which, like Brad, I do like the language. I just don't know how feasible it might be to have all 5 presbyteries agree on the exact ways that the Constitution wasn't followed.
And I think
all it would require is faith, hope, and charity, man.
I think if you even uphold the Constitution, getting 5 presbyteries to even overture the assembly on a single issue, even when it's popular is still unlikely. Again, both scenarios take some organization and actually to pull them off. You can't just expect them to happen out of nowhere. They have to be organized.
All right. Well, let's move on. We don't have to go too long tonight, but boundary changes. So this is only of interest to people who are in these presbyteries. But I think it's an evidence of the grassroots nature of Presbyterianism. The General Assembly can't order a presbytery to be formed or determine its bounds. Basically, you have two presbyteries. If they want to change the way they overlap, they both send in their request, and the PCA General Assembly will either approve it or not approve of it. And I don't know of a time that there's ever been a rejection of. I'm sure there probably has been some time. There maybe a couple should have been rejected. Some or kind of metropolitan micro presbyteries that weren't viable ever, and then became less viable and then went away. I have one in mind, but I think I don't know. Is there anything interesting to say about the change of presbytery boundaries?
Well, this is the whole reason I'm on the show, to talk about these four overtures. Well, I'm not going to say much on this, but I will say, Brad, that if you go back into Presbyterian history, in both the North and the South, there was severe issues coming out of presbyteries who were doing the same exact thing that you were talking about, forming these little cliche micro presbyteries so that all their votes would be aligned with each other. And then you have those little micro presbyteries carrying the same weight when it came to, BCO ratifications and things like that as a larger presbytery and a more conservative presbytery. But that can be for our listeners to go delve into on their own. But that is a historical precedent that has been set to kind of divide presbyteries to have more quote unquote like-minded affinity groups. How about that?
Yeah, well, we don't say the word affinity groups on this show, but we'll just
It's
edit that out,
spaces,
Matt.
spaces.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, well, this is
That's right.
since 2016 we have been the safe space of the PCA, and I challenge anyone to challenge that. Now, so a lot of presbyteries with weird names like Warrior and PD, they're named after rivers. And rivers are before there were bridges everywhere, rivers were often the boundaries of presbyteries, and they still are in some cases. And I was doing some research on a case, I don't want to get into the details, but it kind of mattered where a person lived. And it was in the Northeast, and it was right down to like this, if you're on the east side of this avenue, you're in this presbytery, and if you're on the west side of that avenue, that street, you're in a different presbytery. So it does get very precise. Usually it's county, but sometimes it's the river. So that's a Presbyterian tidbit that may be uniquely American. I don't know.
We've spent more time talking about this than I anticipated.
Yeah, that's.
Well, I'll give some back history on PD when we were multiplying Palmetto Presbytery. Palmetto Presbytery was half the state. We multiplied into 3 presbyteries. PD is the old PCUS name for this area. And so my session argued pretty vehemently that we name our new presbytery PD to redeem the PCUS name. So we wear it as a badge of honor down here in the deep South, South Carolina.
All right, we've got an authority who's weighed in. One Melton Duncan says that the Georgia Foothills Metro Atlanta Presbytery line goes right through the PCA headquarters building.
So it depends on what office you have.
So
where
if you're in
presbytery.
if you're in the restroom, you're in one presbytery, and if you're in the main conference room, you're in another one. I think that's what this implies. So you could seek safety in the restroom. But Who knows? Who knows what the implications of this are? See, I knew this was going to be fun. Now, you said a dirty word earlier, affinity something, Matt. But now we come to some real foul language. Study committees. So I guess we need to talk about these things. There were two of them. They came in pretty early. When they come in early, that generally implies that someone was thinking about it last year and they jumped right on it, or it's an issue that someone is pretty passionate about. So let's look at these, number 3 and 4, and they both involve more foul language, Christian nationalism. We'll hear what you guys think about this, but then I have thoughts and have had, and I wrote about these months and months ago. Explain, Scott, explain these overtures to us and the implications of it. What happens if passed? And there's a cost issue, and we've seen the headquarters, the administrative committee, become less and less happy about having to pay or organize these things.
So both of these overtures are dealing with perhaps to provide what the Reformed position is concerning matters of civil authority and the church, and what the distinctions therein are. My hot take on both of these overtures is maybe 6 months ago they were more pertinent in my mind. It seems that there's been a lot of fragmentation within these groups, and their own witness has somewhat been perhaps curbed. And so maybe 6 months ago, some of this would have been even more hot than it is today. It seems to me that a lot of the Christian nationalism stuff has cooled down, at least from my vantage point. But what would happen is that a committee would study this topic, whatever is assigned to it from these overtures or the overtures committee. They would produce a report and perhaps some recommendations if the assembly allows them for
Now,
further publication.
The committee would be appointed by the moderator, typically. So that's one of the reasons moderators are important.
Yep. It's probably one of the, when the study committees are around, the moderator has an indispensable role to play when shaping and forming these committees. But we've been in a fatigue. We haven't had a committee since we had human sexuality and DASA were the last two committees that we've had. And it seems that after those committees, the overtures committee has really been, we don't really want to do any more of these at the moment. And so we'll see if the cool down period's over and they're ready for another one. Perhaps a brief statement would be a little easier on the assembly than having a year or a multi-year study of a topic when there's already so much rich history out there with the Reformed tradition on this stuff.
Well, let me reveal a little something here. There is an overture written that it's not been passed yet by any court, but it could come through in time. And I'm not sure from which presbytery, but it's basically asking for an unfunded a small committee that would put together a pastoral letter on what the standards say about church and state, with our version of the Westminster standards, but also our Book of Church Order. The first few pages has something to say about this as well. So that may come before the assembly, and it might be viewed as an alternative to these things, in as much as it won't cost any money. Like, for instance, the humble petition to the magistrate on child sex change procedures, that didn't cost any money. You had 5 or 6 really solid guys it was a great group that the mod father, Fred Greco, put together. He was the moderator that year. And they didn't require travel or a big budget or any budget, just a few meetings and some tasking, and they put together this thing. And that's sort of what I think this potential overture would, it'd be more timeless, because it wouldn't be dealing with personalities or something that was, current 6 months ago, but isn't now. It would be more for the ages sort of thing. So that we could see that. I also believe, I think these committees might bring the wrong kind of attention to this issue, in that some would view it as validation that we're studying it, and some would, view it as a provocation, and some would just have a big time with it. And I'm not sure it would end up being helpful. I don't think they're framed properly. I don't think what they attribute the impulse to is actually correct, because it's almost modeled on the old Federal Vision Committee and tied to, certain millennial views and certain views of theonomy, but there's a lot more to this issue than that. So it's been a while since I've looked at them, but maybe I'll append the piece I wrote about these to the show notes if I think about it. So these are the only two study committees per se.
So far.
Yeah, so far. So we'll see. All right, let's see. What else do we need to look at? Let me move back to your list. Study committees. They're essentially identical requests.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you can take that as one. Now this next one involves study and committees, but it's not really a study committee. And Matt, can you explain Overture 5, which would constitutionalize? Now let me give a quick try to explain everything. There are portions of our directory for public worship that are not constitutionally binding. A few sections are, several sections aren't. But tell us what this would make binding and constitutional, have the force of church law, 4 chapters in the directory for public worship, which are not now binding. So tell us about this.
Yeah. So, like you said, there's just the sections on the sacraments that are constitutionally binding, and then one phrase in the solemnization of marriage chapter that no minister in the PCA will perform any wedding that's not between a male and a female, or a man and woman. And so when it comes to chapters 60 through 63, there's really nothing here that we should disagree on. So chapter 60 is the visitation of the sick. Chapter 61 is the burial of the dead or funerals. 62 is special days of fasting and thanksgiving. And then 63 is Christianity in the home. So essentially talking about family worship. The typical arguments against this is going to be, of course, that our founding fathers didn't want a constitutional directory of public worship, which is just, I would say I'm 99.9% sure that is a factual error, since they put in a mechanism to constitutionalize it. They just never did it. Years later.
They presbycrastinated.
Yep.
Don't be Mormon.
Don't be. Yeah, exactly. But another one of the arguments that we're going to hear against this is that there's a lot of shoulds or mays that are verbalized in those chapters, and they're going to say, well, how can we essentially constitutionalize pious advice? It's worded as pious advice, therefore it shouldn't be constitutionalized. And I'm sure there's going to be some nitpicking on semantics because some of the language in the BCO is outdated. But there is seemingly either a lack of care on having a constitutionalized directory of worship, or a pretty aggressive dislike of a constitutionalized directory of worship. Again, I mean, these chapters are really nothing burgers. I mean, they're common pastoral duties, common household duties. But I'm sure we're going to hear things like, well, do you expect the elders to be family worship police to make sure every single family in the church is doing family worship? My answer would be yes. But nonetheless, I mean, that's going to be some of the things that we
I think
hear
most
against
people
it.
would say it should be encouraged. That giving it more force would give you more encouragement to
Sure, absolutely.
encourage it and teach it. I think that's probably the thrust. Now, I did say, let me correct myself. I said committee and study here. I think there is an overture in the pipeline somewhere that would call for. I mean, I've seen it, but I don't know if it'll be passed. Will call for a committee to propose a binding directory for public worship.
And so what's helpful here is that would not be a study committee. That there would be an ad hoc committee in order to make proposals. And so they're not merely studying something to produce a report. They're actually working towards the end of producing a constitutionally binding directory. And so it's a little different, perhaps tomato, tomato, but their goal is not to produce a statement, but to make recommendations to the assembly, whether that be through the overtures committee or through the assembly itself, directly to the assembly on what to put forward. And so that there's perhaps a split view on how to go about working through a constitutional directory. Some are like the ones that we're discussing now with the overture to just constitutionalize a bunch of chapters. Another approach is perhaps a little slower and methodical in that it would reshape the actual content.
Yeah.
But what I brought up and what you just described may or may not come for the assembly.
Right.
I don't know that it's an idea.
You're sounding like a
It might be up
prophet
there.
today. That's what I'm hearing. All this prophetic language.
No,
Well-
look, we're trying to add value. We hear things and we can say, look, this could happen. We're not, the president's spiritual advisor, Paula White. We do not have the gift of prophecy. Matt used to when he was a charismatic, but he doesn't have
That's
it
right.
anymore. So
What's
he worth?
I lost it when I walked into a PCA church. In thinking about this ad hoc committee, if it does come through the pipeline, it's not as if they're going to take a year and then bring every chapter amended for the General Assembly or the overtures to discuss, debate, amend, and then bring it forth. But they're looking at a kind of a long haul, 3 to 5 years of working through each chapter, working through the language. And admittedly, this is my personal opinion. The chapters that Calvary is proposing to make constitutional, I would prefer to see that just listed in an appendix somewhere. This is how you visit the sick. This is how you do a funeral. I mean, we have a marriage ceremony at the back of our BCO, kind of walking you through how to do a proper marriage ceremony or something like that. These chapters would be, I think, great there as pious advice. But I mean, as the listeners know at this point, I think I am for a constitutional directory of worship. I do think that there's some language that could be modernized, and some of the language in there changed completely.
So we should note that the PCA is maybe the only conservative confessional Presbyterian church without a binding directory for worship.
Right. Yeah.
And we've done shows on that before, and we talked about it last year. So that's just for what that's worth. There it is. We're either so special that we don't need it, or maybe we're missing something that everyone else figured out.
Put Matt and I on the committee, and we'll get it done in a year. That's promise
right.
to you.
Yep. Buckle up for the next General Assembly, because we got the whole directory of worship to pull.
We got 50
pull through.
chapters to put through.
President Trump's personal development of the COVID vaccine will pale in comparison.
Yeah, we'll have to keep his sleep schedule. That's for sure. I think that if I can give a personal prediction here, if you remember last year, we had an overture to constitutionalize the chapter on preaching, and that came out of PD Presbytery, my Presbytery, and it failed by a narrow margin on the floor. And so, if you take something that the whole assembly should be agreeing on, that the preaching of the word is the most important element of our worship, and that fails. I just don't see this one passing, though I applaud the efforts to constitutionalize the Directory of Public Worship in and of itself.
Yeah, it keeps the issue before us. So
Right. Yeah, it serves a purpose, for sure.
all right, let's very quickly, candidates and ordination, some rules about coming under care. That's someone who believes they're called to the ministry. It's the step before even licensure, usually encompasses the time while someone is doing an internship and doing seminary. Overture 8 from Nashville, which I actually proposed a different what I thought was an improved version of it in our presbytery, and it failed. I was shot down like a big old buck in the fall, and but it would require ruling elders and deacons, so all the officers of the church, to state differences with the Constitution. It would sort of apply good faith subscription strictures, although not as strict, not as much, not as complicated as now applied to ministerial candidates and active pastors. And then there's another one on the assistant pastor, which is a controversial role in the PCA because an assistant pastor is hired by the session and can be dismissed by the session and does not have a vote on the session, though they are members of Presbytery. So, Scott, anything you want to say about these three involving candidates and ordination, but also and also candidates for local church office?
Yeah, so Overture 6 is trying to give the presbytery liberty to perhaps allow a shorter time period. The current book says you have to file to come under care a month in advance with the presbytery, and so this overture would basically allow presbytery standing rules to shorten that to whatever they would like.
So maybe if you're in the car on the way to Presbytery and you decide you're called to the ministry, can you just roll
Just
up?
send it in. Yeah.
If the standing rules allow it. I don't know. I'm type A kind of person, and so that kind of stuff, flexibility doesn't, you just ask my wife, flexibility isn't natural to me, and so I don't like it. But eight's good. I like it.
And that's why you said this once.
No one wanted to be on my team.
Yeah.
No, that's
No
exactly
one
right.
wanted to be on my
Why is
team.
that on your soundboard still?
Oh, because I love it.
That was like 2 years ago.
It's still here.
The assistant pastor one is a little too clunky for me too. If you read through it, it talks about a congregation offering consent by a 3/4 vote, which is a higher threshold than even calling an associate. And so it just seems kind of odd to me, its structure as it relates to associate pastors. It's a good conversation starter. I just don't think it's the right solution, and that's my personal opinion on it, though.
Yeah, there's
Yeah,
a degree to which overtures are expressions of sentiment. I mean, that may
Yeah.
be inefficient, but sometimes overtures are put forward just to spur debate and just to keep an issue active and before the church. And I don't think it's probably always been that way. It's probably not new, but we particularly seem to do that.
Yeah,
My-
I
Go
like
ahead.
the idea of putting a temporary status on the call of an assistant pastor to be made an associate. If you talk to churches that have assistant pastors, and we do, we have an assistant pastor who we're in the conversations with to make an associate. At this point, he's been here 3.5 years. The reason why we did it, the reason why many churches do it, is because they want to call somebody, they see a pretty immediate need, and so the session forms a search committee. They call a guy, want to make sure the fit is working and the job is being performed well, and then you can quote unquote promote him. I think it was David Gilbert on Fathers and Brothers here recently who said the difference in an assistant and associate is $10,000. So you give them a nice little raise, and you make them associate, and it's more permanent. And they're called by the congregation at that point. They know the man's gifts and his work ethic and his love for the church. And so, I think most guys who call assistant pastors, or most sessions that call assistant pastors, are doing it with a temporary mindset in that. And I like the idea of making it 5 years. I think that's reasonable. My concern is the same concern that Scott just brought up, that is 75%. And the only thing I can think of is that these people, this congregation now knows this man, for 3 to 5 years, and therefore the threshold should be higher. But I can't answer what the presbytery was thinking specifically, but that would be my guess.
It doesn't have symmetry with other parts. So
right, right.
I think the assistant pastor provision is kind of wonky, but I do see the thing I see it's good for. Let's say you've got a church with maybe 2 pastors, or maybe just one senior pastor, and a retired PCA minister moves into the area, and they would like to work, 2 days a week doing visitation and preach once a quarter, or once one Sunday night every month, and a lot of times that's a person that the congregation does already know. It could be a former pastor or something like that. It's pretty convenient to be able, and a lot of times they're not getting paid much at all because they're retired. They have income when you pay them, but you don't pay them much. And I think for that, it's a pretty valid use of the office or the role. But I do, having someone not having a vote on the session and not being called by the congregation, it's that idea of imposing someone. I don't know of a case where a session has hired an assistant that caused a lot of controversy in the church and caused a big problem. Because generally assistants are not terribly visible. They don't, they're not running the show, and they're not the main attraction, if you will. But anyway, to look and read up in the BCO about the assistant pastor if you don't know, because your church may have assistants and associates, and you don't even understand what that is, and you should. I think it's fairly important. I think the next section is actually the most interesting, and it would make changes to the Constitution that would change the way local churches operate. So, Scott, give us an overview there, and this touches on some hot button issues in some ways.
Are we talking about Overture 12? You want me to focus on that one particularly?
12, 13, 12, 13, 19, 22. But I don't know. I don't remember the vows one, but the voting age thing is interesting too.
My favorite of the lot is Overture 12 here. It clarifies who is to distribute the elements. We were just talking about
of the Lord's Supper.
Of the Lord's Supper. And we were just talking about what was constitutional in our directory. Well, 58 is constitutional. And so this amendment would seek to clarify by saying who can actually hand out the elements. This was written by a dear friend of mine and a mentor out of Providence Presbytery. And it's simple. And I personally find it uncontroversial, but I'm sure there'll be some latitudes asked for when considering who can distribute. But it makes perfect sense for the officers of the church to distribute the elements, since they are the ones that are under the pastoral. They're the ones caring pastorally for the congregation. They know their needs, and they know who shouldn't be taking more than anyone else in the congregation. So it makes good ordinary sense for the officers to distribute the elements. And so it's a minor change in words, but perhaps a little more in the detail of that.
Yeah, and generally I think the session members should do it because they know who's under discipline, and they probably are assigned certain members each. We have care groups, a lot of assigned to different elders and deacons, and if you see someone not taking the Lord's Supper for 3 months in a row, that's a pastoral trigger. You want to know why that is. And if you see people taking it who are under discipline, or you have good reason to believe are not or never have been members of an evangelical church, if they're even though they may be visitors, that's for the officers. That's not for there are churches where children help distribute unordained people. I know they're unordained because they wear dresses. I hope there's no ordained people who wear dresses in the PCA. I don't think there are.
Do kilts count as dresses?
I'm not going to weigh in on that. I'm gonna leave that one alone. But yeah, it is connected. The discipline and the sacraments are connected, and it's very. I think it's critically important. And I think it says something. Well, it certainly communicates something. Whether you have officers conducting the Lord's Supper, or just anyone. And we could go into the diversity of practice, but I think most people have an idea what we're talking about. Anything, Matt? Any thoughts on this one?
I mean, this is one of the overtures that has made it to the Twitter sphere pretty heavily, and
It's X. It's not Twitter.
It's X. Sorry, Elon. I'll answer my "What have I done at work today?" 5-point email tomorrow. I promise. One of the kind of the pushbacks that we're hearing is for church planters who have no officers. Well, how are we going to do the Lord's Supper if unordained people can't help distribute? And my personal opinion is that's really a preference of how you want to distribute the elements, rather than really seriously considering how Christ would like us to administer the Lord's Supper. He said very clearly that it's the elders of the church that have the keys to the kingdom, and so everything that y'all just said about pastoral duties and shepherding is all true. And so if you're the only pastor and there's no elders at this church plant, maybe it would be better for those families to come receive the Lord's Supper from you at the front, so that I think that is that argument doesn't hold a lot of water for me, to be fair.
All right, Scott. The next one, Overture 13, regarding voting.
Yeah, it's just a minor change that seeks to clarify what the antecedent of "they" is, which is those who are communing members in good standing. It's really small. It doesn't seem to change much of anything in the substance of it. I'm guessing that Presbytery had an issue where they were trying to figure out what "they" was, and there was some conflict.
That sounds like Bill Clinton. Is Bill Clinton involved in this?
It's the Midwestern Presbytery. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't think so.
And so that's not a real. I don't know if that will. I'm sure we'll get an explanation from a rep from that Presbytery explaining why they think this is really needed. But it's really trimmed down even in the whereas statements. And then you have 19 and 22. You have membership vows that are added for 19. This would be a change in the local church. I don't know if I find them personally helpful. I thought that when I first saw this overture, it was going to be with the Trinity, and I was surprised
which failed.
when it was not the Trinity.
Right. My session sent up an overture maybe 4 years ago to add explicit belief in the Trinity to the vows, and most of our sister denominations have that vow, and we don't. We had a discipline case in our own church where someone denied the Trinity, but thought that there was nothing absolutely in in the in our standards that required them to affirm the Trinity the way we understood it. So I thought it was a pretty inoffensive overture, and it failed. So again, this is what I thought this was too, but this is it's very modern language. It's about the image of God. I think the first vow after this would be, do you agree that you were made in the image of God, designed by God to glorify God and enjoy Him forever? So it's a vow. It's a question about agreement. It's not really it's weird as a vow. And do you acknowledge yourself to be both beloved and sinners? Not just do you acknowledge yourself to be a sinner? And then there's a little modernization of the word study. Instead of study the purity and peace, promote the purity and peace. That's inoffensive to me. But I don't like this one at all. I think the first two changes that are proposed are just a little out. It doesn't sound right, and it also sounds like a certain, I don't know, what am I thinking? A certain ethos or a certain modern vibe about that, which I find unhelpful.
Yeah.
Coach?
Well, I don't like number one, but number two, I just have, we're beloved by the Father in Christ, and that vow is trying to get to the theological point that apart from the work of the Holy Spirit that comes later on, we are totally depraved, incapable of coming to the Father through the Son. We don't want anything to do with the gospel. The Holy Spirit changes our hearts, and then we flee to Christ in faith and repentance and have a sense of renewed obedience. And so I just think that word in and of itself does not fit in that question. I think that vow is trying to help affirm that we believe that the wages of sin is death. And apart from Christ, that is the right judgment, the just judgment of the Father. And so, I would have much rather seen another Trinity vow coming through the pipeline rather than this one.
Yeah, you get the point that there's actually a trajectory in the vows that you're making, and there's a poetic trajectory with starting as a sinner and then what comes after that, and even your salvation as you're working towards that. And so this kind of truncates a lot of that and mixes it, and it becomes less poetic. But the flow is actually altered quite a bit throughout.
Yeah, and it's sort of meant to, I don't know, I think it's meant to remove the offense of being told, leading with the fact that you're a sinner.
Right.
If you think the 5 points of Calvinism are a pretty valid way to explain Reformed theology, I guess we need to sweeten the tea up a little bit. The first one, total depravity. This starts with total depravity. That's what this vow is about, unamended. But it would be rather diluted by this one. All right.
Personally, I would have rather, I think the better change would have been strike through sinner, and added something, like brokenness, or you acknowledge yourself to be a broken individual, or something along those lines.
You're banned. You're never coming back.
Not allowed in this group.
So we're not crazy about 19. This one, which is it 22, Scott?
Yeah, 22.
I really don't like. And let me. It would allow sessions to set a minimum voting age for congregational members. Typically in the PCA, young people join between, I'd say, generally the ages of 9 and 13. They become communing members. That's just, that's somewhere in there is sort of the average. I guess we've had a couple of 5 or 6 year olds, maybe a few 7 or 8 year olds, but generally it's going to be 9, 10, 12. And But there are churches in the PCA, and I'm not going to pull any punches here. Some of these churches would like to be doing paedo communion, and they have people in there. They have a number of members among them who wish they could give their infants the elements. That's prohibited by our standards, if you just a fair reading of them. But there's a workaround, and it's called young child communion. And in churches, and not in every case, but in a lot of these churches, they wish they could give it to the babies. But the compromise is, yeah, we could pretty much, it's going to be kind of normal for every 4 and 5 year old who can verbalize a little bit about doctrine to be admitted to the table. It's a very low standard for membership. And I don't know, but my assumption is, and if this is an uncharitable assumption, forgive me, I think this is a workaround for young child communion. I think churches have admitted very young children to the table, and then they have an election or they vote on a building program or something like that, and they're worried about, I mean, maybe there have been some crazy results, but I don't want to change. I don't want to take voting rights away from legitimate communing members because somebody did something goofy connected to paedo communion, and I really think it's connected. I'm sorry, but I'd like to hear what you all think about this. So basically, I mean, parents have some responsibility to know if their child is able, even though they're maybe a communing member, maybe they don't understand the elements of this building program, or they don't know the officers like an adult would. So they might suggest to the child, don't vote. I think my workaround is you give all the kids purple crayons to mark their ballots. And when you go to count those, you can count
don't
the
count
people. The people who no, it's just like if all the weird votes are in the purple crayon, then maybe you look at the percentages a little differently. That's my big idea. But what do you guys think?
There are three things that I think about this overture. One, it's incredibly long. That it makes
And
you
how
want
long
to
is
limit
it? How long is
19
it?
pages. It's
Yeah,
it's
that's
longer
the
than
definite.
many of my seminary papers.
That's the poison pill. 19-page. This is the TLDR overture.
Yeah, if you want to get anything passed, it should not take 19 pages. Ironically, the second resolve is saying that we have to keep all 19 pages as we approve it, which if it takes 19 pages to convince someone that this is good for the church, that typically doesn't bode well for the assembly. And there's too much of a barrier of education that must go on before you could say yes to this. But one of the principles that we hold in Presbyterianism, that those who have professed faith choose their leaders. Those who profess faith in the Lord Jesus Christ have the liberty to choose their leader.
More grassroots.
And to restrain that in any capacity. You might have issues with the assistant pastor, but this is going from the opposite end of who in the congregation. And the amendment here doesn't specify what the age could be. It maybe alludes to it in a mild way. You have to go to page 19, 18 or 19 to see other amendments to this amendment that could give a minimum voting age. But as it's currently written, you could have a 35-year-old not eligible to vote because of the congregation limiting their voice and rights. And so if a child is professed faith, is able to discern the body of the Lord Jesus Christ in Holy Communion, they should also have the right to choose who rules them. They go hand in hand. And so if you're going to administer the sacrament to anyone, they ought to have also the liberty to choose who leads them. This is preliminary principle stuff. And so this overture has been tried before. I don't know. I don't think it will pass, but it'll sure probably be a large discussion, if I had to guess, at the assembly.
I was thinking along the lines of both of you guys, I do think that this is a way to admit children, 3 and 4 year olds to the table, but not let them vote. And yet at the same time, I think it goes against basic Presbyterianism, where the congregation has the right to elect their officers, elders and deacons. One of the things, so I do think that Brad's onto something. But one of the things that I thought about was simply, if your church has admitted a 7 or 8 year old to the Lord's table, and they're mature and able to discern the body, how much more important is it to make sure that they're able to discern the body and take the Lord's Supper rightly than cast one vote for an elder election or a deacon election? I mean, the disciples cast lots to choose the 12th disciple. Surely we can tolerate, one child voting for Mr. Jim Bob Jones because he gives them candy every week. If it's that close, there's other provisions in the BCO that help navigate those waves.
I'm telling you, it's the purple crayon solution.
It's the purple crayon solution.
That would do it. All right, so you wonder if there might be, minority reports on some of these things that would get them before the assembly and what that debate would be like. But you'll just have to stay tuned, and we'll talk about this some more. All right, so we're down to the last three. We won't go much longer. Overture 9 would take some voting, ironically, some voting privileges away from some certain denominational officials on certain boards, I think. And then Overture 11's got to do with Bitcoin. My wife was at the assembly a couple of years ago, and she was fascinated by the Bitcoin. And that had to do with a Committee of Commissioners report, I think. But the whole Bitcoin thing was fascinating and bizarre, but this may not be exactly the same thing. And then there's just a fairly boring thing about updating some RUF manual issues. But Scott, I think you're well placed to describe Overture 9 being a member of the Administrative Committee.
So the general desire with Overture 9, the AC is actually, its makeup is a little different than all of the other agencies and boards. 55% or so of the AC is actually directly elected by the assembly itself, but the other 45% or so are actually representatives appointed by the other boards. And so what you have is a mixed makeup where every MNA will send a representative, MTW will send a representative, typically the chairman or his designee, and they will represent their permanent committee before the AC concerning their particularly matters that are germane to them. And so when you're at an AC meeting, it's actually a fairly large meeting. This is outside the scope of the overture, but you typically have all of the elected members. You have the coordinators of the various agencies there, along with the stated clerk and his staff. And so there's like 50 people at these meetings. And this overture would seek to make those who are appointed by the actual other agencies merely advisory members. And so they would still have they'd have the influence on the floor of debate and discussion. Their input would be vital still in that regard. But when it came to voting, they would no longer have that right. And so that's the scope of Overture 19. I don't want to wade too much into it, given that I'm a permanent committee member, but that's the structure.
All right, so this is sort of a grassroots thing too. And would some of those people who have voting rights now be unordained?
I do not believe so. They're typically teaching elders or ruling elders.
Okay, but they're not. They're they're hired or appointed by the boards, but they've been approved by the General Assembly at some level. But they're not commissioners. I mean, they're not coming up from the assembly the way a member like yourself or other elected members, elected each General Assembly in different classes to serve on there. And so there's always a concern. I mean, sometimes it's overblown, but the idea of top-down leadership. I mean, there were some moves about 10 years ago by the AC and the Cooperative Ministries Committee, which is another one of these kind of super committees that really rubbed people the wrong way, because they were driving the conversation and proposing legislation or a study committee or something, and it was troubling to some of us. And this is sort of meant to counteract that top-down centralizing tendency that many organizations gravitate toward to rather naturally. So, any quick thoughts on that, Matt?
No, I think you explained it well. I think that this is my personal opinion. I think this is a good overture. I think there could be some work done on it in the overtures committee, but I think the spirit of it is helpful for the grassroots nature of the PCA.
All right. Well, amazingly, I think this has been more entertaining and fast moving than I expected. I think you all have done a good job. Any closing remarks? We won't wear everyone out. Sometimes we try to go a little shorter than an hour and a half, and we're going to make that tonight. So, any closing thoughts? Any things to look for? Do each of you have like one overture you want to predict is going to come before the assembly that's not in this list that would be significant? But just whatever you got, Scott.
I won't make any predictions. I have predictions in my mind, but I don't want to say them out loud.
Okay, everyone, be really quiet, and we're going to try to divine what Scott knows. Okay.
Mel Duncan probably he's always talking about prophets and predictors, and so he probably can predict some good overtures.
I wouldn't be surprised if we got that ad hoc committee to start working on the directory of worship. I think that would be a good compromise on the way to move forward. All the amendments and the chapters, kind of 2 or 3 at a time, are coming before us to work through. And so I wouldn't be surprised if that one came through here in the next few weeks. But there are directive overtures that could still come all the way up until May. So buckle up, register for GA, bring some ruling elders.
Yeah, I think it's actually going to be spicy. I think there's going to be some overtures that come up that are related to the whole M&A kerfuffle, and maybe some other things. I mean, they're going to have a kind of a slight political flavor. I mean, there's going to be some, cultural tensions and issues that are going to color some of these things. Maybe we'll do Presby Doge, and there'll be who knows. There may be. I think I saw a proposed overture or two that would require some audits and some new oversight, and that would smack of the things that Doge is doing. But I'm not sure about that. That may never come before us either. But I think I think there are enough live issues that if you're concerned about the PCA, you probably want to come this year. And those are just going to build over the next couple of months. And that's really the reason I wanted to do this show now, because I think we're probably going to have to do 4 or 5 more GA preview shows before all is said and done. And can't promise I'll have you two on for every one of those, because we've got some other eminent luminaries that we'll have to bring in. And you could guess who those are, but
I think your prediction could easily come to pass. sessions don't like to see their denomination in the news. I'll just put it that way, you know. And we've gotten a lot of news attention here lately, and that kind of fires up the local guys much more than us teaching elders.
Yep.
All right. Well, Resby had to leave us because he's got to get up early in the morning. So I guess I'll talk us out, and you know, whether it's whether in the old OPC, the old PCUSA, or in the PCA, we would all, you know, always we're going to say that you shouldn't be an erdman. And if you don't know what an erdman is, well, look it up. It's just it's not where you want to go. You want to be a faithful Presbyterian, committed to our distinctives and to our church. Thanks.
What's wrong with you people?